I never thought I'd be hosting a podcast, but we are going strong. Today is a great time for you to get your message out there. And guess what? It's not that hard. Find the right partner. For us at the XM Podcast, that was Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout gets you listed in all the major podcast directories like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. Follow the link in the show notes and let Buzzsprout know the XM Podcast sent you. Get a $20 credit after your second paid invoice. It really helps support our show.
Welcome to the XM Podcast. Here is your host, mental health therapist, Matthew Kanabe.
I am very hard on myself, dealt with severe anxiety.
And it made me feel like a monster. I didn't have the energy to care.
There was just nothing more but to face what I had been running from.
I'm already an anxiety-filled mess.
It's just love. Like, it just goes back to love.
Well, I'm super excited about the podcast that we have for you today. This episode is really interesting because it was a shot-in-the-dark Facebook message that brought our guest and myself together. Recently, Dr. Dave Blankenship was on the show talking about PTSD. While I was prepping and doing some research for that episode, I kept seeing this book show up in my searches. After the second or third time I saw it, I ended up doing some digging into what the book was about. Over a weekend, I ended up reading the book and then taking a chance by messaging the author. He quickly replied, and we began to discuss a possible interview. He has an amazing story that I know many of you will connect with. It has been really great to get to know him a bit through this process. So please welcome to the XM Podcast, author of the book The Shelf, Dave DeRemer.
Well, thanks for having me, Matt. My name's Dave DeRemer. I am 48 years old. I spent 23 years in the Air Force. I retired in January 2016. I've spent all of my life in the military up to that point. Now I work for the VA, helping veterans that deal with a lot of the things that we're probably going to talk about today.
Yeah.
Blessed to have met my person a few years ago right here in Nashville, Tennessee. So married, and I have 3 daughters, all adults from previous marriage. My oldest has 2 sons, so I'm a grandpa too. And I inherited a 4th girl in the new marriage. So I have a 13-year-old stepdaughter. So girl dad all the way.
I'm right there with you, by the way. Girl dad all the way. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't have had it any other way after I had my first one, I tell you.
Yeah.
But they kept me busy, and the 13-year-old keeps me busy again. I didn't think that I was going to do the marriage and raising kids thing again, but God had other plans for me, and it all worked out great. So I'm here living the dream in Nashville. Yeah, and
that's great. The audience knows I have a firm affinity for Nashville. Spent a lot of time there. I lived there for about 15 years of my young adult life, and just love that area. I still have family that live in Nashville. So Dave, I'd like to talk a little bit about just your experience, your life experience. Maybe if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your childhood, and that'll kind of lead us into the conversation that we're going to have today, if you wouldn't mind.
I don't really remember a whole lot of good things about when my actual parents were together. Ultimately, they ended up getting divorced when I was real young. And I remember that my brother and I, my brother's a couple years younger, we ended up leaving with our mother. And during those years, you're talking kindergarten, first grade sort of years, 5, 6 years old. I remember bouncing around to a lot of different places. I remember a night sleeping in a car. There was just a lot of bouncing around. Mom working a job or 2 jobs. I don't have a relationship with either one of them now, but what I will say about her is I feel like she was doing everything that she could. My father was more of he cared about himself, narcissistic type person. As I look back now, I know that. And it seemed like my mother was trying to do everything she could, but in that was her being gone all the time. and us being with babysitters and a lot of babysitters who didn't treat us very good. And we bounced from house to house and school to school. And there was just a lot of that. And I don't profess to have had the worst childhood ever.
Sure.
For me, that abandonment came from early on, from parents splitting up. And then ultimately my mom met a man who was great for her and great for my brother in the end. Initially, I wasn't fond of having someone else try to be my dad. He wasn't my dad, like kids do. Mm-hmm. And in the end, when it came down to it, that attitude as a little kid toward him resulted in, if you don't like it, then go live with your dad. And that's exactly what my mother allowed happen. Mm-hmm. I remember one day it happened, and I'm sitting out on the curb waiting for my dad to come get me, and he got me and took me away. And, there was everything that I knew, and to include my brother, was gone. Mm-hmm. And I rarely saw him after that. He came, he did the every other weekend thing. And then because he was treated so bad there, like I was, he just stopped coming. And I was glad, it was what was best for him. So I say all that to say, there was abandonment, or a feeling of abandonment, right from the start for me. And ultimately it came out in my adult life that a lot of the things and that I dealt with stemmed from that I never even knew.
What was the experience like for you when you got to your dad's house? I mean, you kind of go into pretty big, deep detail of that in your book.
Yeah. And I don't know that we need to get into that specific here, but
okay.
That, and I absolutely don't mind doing that, but, in general, it was, and granted, it was the 80s, where I guess beating on your kids was maybe more prevalent than it is today. We can't do a lot of the things that we used to do back then today, but sure. I was physically abused a lot, mm-hmm. Absolutely mentally abused. I had a stepmom who didn't really, I don't know that she really wanted another kid. Mm-hmm. She had a daughter when she met my dad. So it was her, my dad, and me, and my stepsister. Mm-hmm. And my dad, like I said, he was pretty much one who only cared about himself. So mm-hmm. a lot of the things that he did were all about him. And so I was often left with her, and, I got knocked around and told I was never going to amount to much. And I was a piece of this and a piece of that. And the stepsister knocked me around and did whatever she wanted to do. My stepmother had brothers who would come over, and I was essentially bullied by all of them. And my actual father, mm-hmm. didn't seem to care when he was around to notice, which he rarely was. So there was a lot of just growing up in an environment where you knew you weren't wanted, you got beat up, you got talked bad about, and it was just bullying in the true sense of the word, from a stepmother, from a stepsister, from a step uncle, another step uncle, and those sorts of things. So that was it from the time I moved there right up until my junior year of high school. So it was the majority of my life going through that, and trying to navigate those waters the best way that I could.
Well, I'm certainly sorry you went through that. And I mean, that certainly sounds like a difficult childhood. And when you're a junior in high school, becoming a young adult, you said you noticed, these things started to affect you. What are some of the things that you noticed, in adulthood? Because I know, just as a mental health therapist, a lot of times as a child, you go, well, this is my normal. This is my life. And you don't know, you don't realize until maybe you get a little older, that's like, well, you know what, that's not okay. Or that wasn't healthy, or I'm really starting to feel some effects of that. What was your experience in that?
Well, it's funny because, and I will give you one example while I lived with my dad, that made me realize that something was weird. Because I was treated so poorly by my stepmom. There was one day where I came home, and I guess I had been, in her mind, I was always bad. I was always doing something wrong. I was always into something, versus that's just what kids do. But during this stretch of time, I don't remember exactly how long it is, I must have been abnormally good, because I came home one day and there was a pack of baseball cards in a chair. And it would be whenever I was allowed to watch TV or hang out with everybody in the living room, there would be a chair that I generally would sit in. And I came home and I noticed that there was a pack of baseball cards in the chair. And that was a big thing for me back then when I wasn't grounded, which was most of the time, collecting baseball cards with the neighborhood kids. And long story short, the baseball cards were for me, and my stepmom told me it was because I had been so good. And I remember thinking, that's not normal. That doesn't happen. And I knew then, even as a kid, that I wasn't bad. I wasn't stealing. I wasn't drinking. I wasn't taking off. I wasn't doing any of those things. I did take off in the middle of the night and run away one time, which was, it was another story. But yeah, to me, the things that I've done for my kids and I do for my teenage daughter now, or just randomly, come home with, I don't know, Starbucks or something that she likes, or see something in a store that she'd been talking about wanting, and now it's Roblox, you need Robux to play this game on, those things. The things now as an adult that I would do for my kids just because I love seeing them happy. That didn't happen for me. So it was like that was odd. It was the opposite. When I actually got praised, it was like, what is this? So, when I think about that, it makes me realize that it was my normal, and that being praised and any of that was not my normal. So going back to your question, I moved back in with my stepmom and stepdad the middle of my junior year. Obviously a lot of growing up had happened between the ages of, 5, 6 to 14, 15, 16. Realizing that Michael was my stepdad. He was a great man. He was a Vietnam veteran though. So he had his things, very kind of isolated, very strict. And we lost him a few years ago, but he was a very influential and positive male role model in my brother's life, and helped raise my brother to be the man he is. True faith, retired military, also lives his life for God with his family and works in the church and does all that. So great influence on him, despite his issues with alcohol and the effects of, what the war had done to him, Vietnam War. I don't know what started it, but I hadn't seen or spent any time with my mother in years. But toward my junior year, we had been back in contact, and then I actually went and visited them, and then my mom came to get me, and me and her and my brother went to the movies, and so there was more interaction with them, and the more interaction I had with her, the more she was hearing about what I was going through. I think that was the tipping point, because she would obviously go back and talk to my stepfather, and I ended up moving back in with them. I was not a dumb kid. I'd been through a lot of things, and maybe going through that gave me a little bit more wisdom beyond my years. But I had written a note And it was just about how much I didn't like my life, didn't like, I was getting beat up all the time and all this. And I just wanted to go live with my mother and all that. And so I'd folded up this note, and I had this little Timex clock on my desk, and I folded up this note and I stuck it underneath the clock, but I'd let it stick out just a little bit so you could see it was there. And I had a stepmother who would every day come in my room, go through all my stuff and try to find things wrong. And so I knew the reason why I did that is because I knew that she was going to come through my room, and she was going to just try to find anything she could to get on me about. And when I got home from school that day, the note was gone. Mm-hmm. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, there was some anxiety, but at the same time, I was like, I'm trying to open a door here. And that ultimately it worked. My dad came home and was like, you want to go live with your mother? Here's the phone, go live with her. And I called her up, and she came and got me that night, and away I went. So that was the middle of my junior year. And when I went back there, that's when things started to change a little bit. It wasn't when I turned 40 and I really started to realize what was going on, but I was treated better. Mm-hmm. I wasn't beat up. I wasn't told I wasn't going to amount to much. Mm-hmm. Suddenly I met a girl who would end up being my fiance, not who I'm married to now, but early on. Mm-hmm. So I had a relationship with a woman, and I'm getting great grades in school, and I'm playing sports, and I'm doing all the things. It was different, but the relationship piece of it was still a struggle for me. I think the biggest thing I could take away from that at that point in my life was, and you hear it sometimes, and people joke around about, oh yeah, you flirt and you do all this, and the whole highs of being in a relationship or trying to be in one, and then when you're actually in one, the flare is gone, and then you lose interest. Mm-hmm. That's actually a thing. When that happens, it's and you react that way to someone, there's probably some underlying things going on there. And that's what I realized later on in life, looking back, that I just wasn't able to fully develop. I had difficulty trusting, mm-hmm. and then building that, fear of rejection, difficulty trusting, all of those PTSD type things, where I just didn't want to get close or get too close. And of course, it was my first girlfriend, and there was leaving for the military and all that involved. But that was when I really started to notice that, just things were kind of off. There mm-hmm. maybe a fear of intimacy there, mm-hmm. Just a lot of the little buzzwords I know now,
sure,
were a result of that.
So a lot of times I share with people and clients, the first maybe quarter of our life is us being shaped, wounded, often broken in some ways. And then it's a journey the rest of our lives trying to figure out how to put those pieces together. And everybody's experience is a little bit different, and there's different levels of trauma. There's usually a point in time where there was a fracture in relationship or something. What were some of the things that, maybe in your early adulthood that you started noticing that you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is probably related to some PTSD? You've talked about, being able to connect relationally, but were there any other things that were going on?
Well, so it wasn't until the tail end of my military career that all of this kind of came out. I came in the military in 93. I met my first wife there in 94, and we got married in 95. And that's when we had our first child. We were married for 18 years. We had a great relationship in the beginning, but I don't know that I was prepared for all of it. I always prepared for being a dad, but I think that's kind of what drove, like a lot of people, it's kind of what drove the decisions to get married and those things early on when you're younger. I was not a good person then. I hadn't walked my journey with God yet. I was the type where I always believed in God, professed I believed in God, but then I could go out and do whatever I wanted wrong, pray, get forgiven, and then go do it again tomorrow. That was the type of person that I was. I lied. I cheated on my wife many times. Not something that I'm proud of, but just something that I can certainly be accountable for now, which I was even with her before my book was published. I sat down with her and talked to her about everything, so she wouldn't be blindsided, which ended up being a great thing for her because it validated that she wasn't crazy when she thought X, Y, and Z was happening over the years. And but I wasn't a good person. I wasn't a good father at times, I feel. And I beat myself up a lot over that, even though my girls tell me not to, because they all turned out wonderful. But I definitely was not a good husband, and realized, that I probably wasn't in a good place to be married that young, with a lot of the underlying things going on. So I don't think in the moment I understood that there may have been some reasons why I was that way. That part of the abandonment piece is that rejection, and then getting into relationships with people you can't really have, and those sorts of things. And I feel like, as I look back, a lot of the underlying things that I know of, that PTSD is maybe the reasons why a lot of those things happen. And, I wish I could take a lot of it back, but, that's how we grow, going through these things. And my ex-wife is remarried and has a wonderful life, just like I do now. So it all in God's plan worked out the way it was supposed to. But for us, we had 3 beautiful kids and a lot of struggle. Trust was a big thing for us, obviously. I probably created a lot of that. Sure. And then just there was a lot of loneliness, even while we were married, not feeling like we weren't really connected all the time. And again, a lot of that due to the lack of trust and what that does to people. But as I got divorced and was nearing retirement, I was in another relationship which was completely toxic, because again, I wasn't a great person then, because this woman was married. And it was the typical, I'm getting a divorce. We don't get along, and we confided in each other, and it ended up becoming something it shouldn't have. And I was just starting to walk down my journey. I was starting to take my journey with God, because after my divorce, I was devastated because of my kids. I knew that the marriage wasn't going to work, but it was the first time I'd ever been without my kids. No helping with homework, no running to games. No, I mean, I was still in their lives, but I wasn't doing the day to day, and it was just killing me. And I finally had to just give it to God and have him help me, because there were some not so great moments in there for me. The relationship that I was in, she was married, and it wasn't, I knew as I just started my journey with God that it wasn't the right thing to do. So I continued to push her away, to try not be in something that I knew God was not approving of. And it didn't end up being that way. We confided in each other, and then ultimately fell in love, and the relationship started. So another relationship that started for the wrong reasons. Like I was saying about my first marriage, young, a pregnancy, a marriage, right? So it didn't necessarily start for the right reasons. It wasn't 2 people fell in love, dated for a year or so, and then got married and had kids. It was not that. Yeah, just right. Like this next one wasn't. The same wasn't right either. And now I talk about that now when I go and I speak on these things, that, if relationships that start for the wrong reasons are destined for failure. And because that's my experience. And I knew all along that she wasn't what God had delivered for me to have forever in my life as a married woman. I knew that, but I was in love, and I couldn't avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of that, but again, as I've learned about the abandonment and that form of PTSD, if you will, it's that attraction to things that you can't have, attraction to things that you can push away, or those types of things. So that, I feel like, had a part in leading me in that direction versus a strong, healthy relationship that started right. And I felt like I deserved, because that was a lot of it too. I think in my mind, I didn't feel like maybe I deserved to have a relationship the right way, or those sorts of things. So I would default to, cheating when I was married, or default to this married woman who's shown an interest in me. And I will preface anything else I say with, I don't use PTSD as an excuse. Now, I'm not saying the reason why I cheated and the reason why I was involved with a married woman is because I have PTSD and abandonment issues and all that. I made decisions that I knew were not the right ones, but there's that thing inside of us that makes us feel a certain way.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a hard thing to, whether your brain is telling you this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, but that thing inside of you, when you deal with PTSD and those things that you deal with that other people don't.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that listeners and people need to understand is you can know in your head that you're doing something you shouldn't be, but that it tugs on you. It's kind of almost like a drug. You wouldn't murder somebody or drive off a road into a ditch because you're drunk or high or whatever. If you were sober, you wouldn't do that. Mm-hmm. I relate it to that, where I know that cheating is wrong. I know that being with a married woman is wrong, but it makes me feel good. Mm-hmm. So it's easy to kind of fall into that trap of doing the things that you may not normally do or whatever, because it feels good. And that, to me, I knew it was wrong, but it felt comfortable. I wasn't so worried about losing this person or them abandoning me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Dave, I appreciate your transparency and your ability to own stuff, because I think that's one of the bigger issues is that, at some point in especially our adult life, we're called to accountability. At the same time, I know from a mental health therapist perspective, you were shaped in a very unhealthy, dysfunctional childhood, and a lot of the early adulthood and into adulthood, you're trying to fill that void. And when you're doing that, I mean, you were almost talking about relationships, almost like an addict would talk about getting the next fix. And that comes, when I look at your book, The Shelf, the second part of the title is Faith, PTSD, and Overcoming Me. And that overcoming me part, I think, is exactly kind of what you were talking about. And knowing that, and again, this isn't to make excuses, but a lot of the abandonment that you experience in childhood, you try to fill that void later in life. I mean, it's a natural progression. But at some point, I think God calls us to accountability, going, look, I recognize that you were wounded and stuff like that. Talk to me about when you were kind of moving more into that faith and that awareness, where God kind of maybe even opened your eyes a little bit to, you were like, wait a minute, this isn't the direction or the choices or whatever that God wants me to do, and how that has affected your life.
Yeah. Well, in my early days, I was a skinny, nerdy kid in school. And a lot of times, because of the fact that I wasn't allowed to go anywhere and do anything and be involved in a lot, I didn't have wasn't able to nurture relationships. I had friends, but not in a way to where I would go to people's houses and go to dances and do all these, be involved in the prom and all that stuff until later on. But so I was the skinny, nerdy kid. And then when I moved back in with my mom, I played basketball and my grades were good. And then I had a girlfriend. So I kind of was feeling a little bit more confident about myself. Then I joined the military. And that's when I really started kind of coming into my own, going to the gym. I played on the varsity basketball team, which was representing the base at other bases and junior colleges and stuff. So I was doing those things. And then, as I'm getting a little bigger and I'm playing sports and I'm getting better at, and girls are starting to notice. And I talk about this a lot. I went from a scrawny, nerdy kid with no self-esteem that felt like I didn't even have a place in the world to a jock who girls are falling all over. And you can go one of two ways with that. Mm-hmm. You can, embrace it in a healthy way, or you can be a cocky, arrogant person who eventually no one's going to like. Mm-hmm. And that was the path that I went down. I mean, if you grew up getting beat on, told you're not going to amount to much, and you're a scrawny little kid and you never had a girlfriend and blah, 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 to all of a sudden, you got some muscle and you're an athlete and people tell you how great you are at this sport and that sport, and girls are, hanging out at these games and coming up to you after, and all this stuff going on. It's like, whoa, what is this? I don't know what it is, but I really like it. So, and that was what happened. I had no humility whatsoever. There was not an ounce of humble inside me. And it started there. That was 93 93, 94, when I first came to the military. And unfortunately, 15 years of that. And so I met my wife, first wife, which was another one of those things. We playing volleyball on the beach. I notice her, she notices me, and we met, and one thing led to another, and, baby, marriage, all that stuff. So, I was like, wow, this beautiful woman. And I was that same guy. Even after I got married, I didn't change. Like a marriage and a child would do to most people, humble you, and your priorities change. You're about your wife and your child, and my priorities never changed. Mm-hmm. I was still all about me. I was still all about look at me, mm-hmm. And I'm not proud to say it now. And my kids will they'll offer some resistance to me saying this, but I could have been a lot better of a dad. I feel like I was born to be a dad, a girl mm-hmm. dad, in fact. Mm-hmm. It's my greatest success. But I wish I could have done some things different, but it didn't humble me. And so as a result of that, one day, years down the road, after all the things that my wife and I had been through, I realized that I was all alone. I had no friends. Then next thing you know, I had no wife. I don't have my kids. And here I am. In my mind, I have no friends. I mean, you always have friends. And as I've told, as a lot of how I've felt through the years has come out, a lot of old friends and people like, we would have never known, or I liked you, or I never thought that about, so you hear that. But in my mind, I was alone. I had nobody. And a lot of that stemmed from just being a cocky, arrogant person who was driving people away. I drove couples and friends that I had when I was married. I drove them away just because of who I was and how I was. And I know that for a fact because I've seen videos of me back then and things I was saying and how I was kind of carrying myself. And I was just completely disgusted at the thought of who I was, and being able to, when you see that right in front of your face, like, wow, no wonder. And no wonder nobody liked me. No wonder no one wanted to be around me. So that was the road that I took until ultimately I felt like I had nothing. I had no one. My marriage was over. My kids weren't gone, but I wasn't with them every day.
Yeah.
I was filling out a security clearance questionnaire, and they wanted just context. I have my brother,
Mm-hmm.
and that was kind of an eye opener for me. I'll never forget it. It's like, I don't have any friends. I don't have anyone to write down here other than my sibling. So it was a harsh reality that you're alone and it's all your fault.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to figure it out. And that was, again, being away from my kids, realizing I was alone, just been divorced. Now I'm in this toxic relationship. And one night I was staying in the basement of some lady's house after I got divorced, or after I left my wife before we got divorced. And I'm laying in bed, crying my eyes out, staring up at the ceiling fan. And I'll never forget the moment. And I just was like, God, I'm giving this all to you. I can't deal with it anymore. And that's when everything changed. And I know it sounds cliche or people think that it's what people of faith say, like, whoa, they just gave it to God and everything was fine. That's what happened. Everything started to kind of turn around for me. So yeah, it was the moment I realized that I was all alone was the moment that was the real eye opener for me.
Yeah. I love that, Dave. And I think it's such an important point to the journey. I spent a lot of time studying scripture and trying to understand, how things work. And I think a lot of times we expect, God to kind of come in and rescue us, where he's actually he's with us in the depths. But much like the prodigal son had to go back to the house. It's like that moment for you. I had a very similar moment in my life in my early 30s, where it was like I was broken. I fell to my knees and I said, God, this piece of crap is all I got. And it was just like this moment of awareness that I was like, I am nothing without you. And just being able to be brutally honest with myself and the shell of the human being that I was at that point. I think that's why, I've connected so much with your story, is because I really felt your experience through that, and kind of knowing that we have this moment where I don't know if everybody experiences God that way. I don't think they do. I think God comes to relationship with each of us in his own way. But a lot of times it's a moment where we have to just kind of go, okay, I'm done doing this on my own. Obviously, everything that I've tried to do on my own has gotten me to where I'm at now. So that isn't the avenue that I need to continue going anymore. And I think that's my pastor was talking the other day about repentance. And repentance really means changing direction. It really comes down to, Lord, I have been heading in a really bad direction on my own. It is time for me to go. I'm done with that. I repent of what I've been doing. And now I'm open to you driving this ship instead of me. And so I think it's really powerful for you to be able to share that. Talk to me a little bit about then your journey to go, I should write a book about this. Like, how does that come out of that? What gives you that inspiration? That's not an easy task then to sit down and go, now I'm going to go and spend time thinking about all of these things that have transpired to this point. How did you get to that point, and what was that experience like?
Well, I can tell you, and as well as I do now, that this is not how God works. But when I started down my journey, I always felt like if I felt like God wanted me to do it, I better do it. Mm-hmm. And if I have thoughts of doing something wrong, God's going to punish me if I do it, mm-hmm. which, as you know, that's not how it works. But mm-hmm. I feel like that mentality was good for me, because it kept me on the straight and narrow in my the infancy of my journey, where I didn't really know, like, God is not going to punish you. God is for you, forgive you. But I didn't want to disappoint him. And I didn't want to, and when I would feel like I wanted to do something wrong, I wouldn't, because I was afraid of what he was going to do to me. What bad thing's going to happen because I failed God.
Mm-hmm.
So it really kept me on the path early on. So I had, my last duty station was in Arizona. I was away from this woman that I had been in this toxic relationship with. There was a lot of trust issues. We were on, we were off. I was in love with her at the time, so it was a struggle dealing with the separation and just going through a lot with missing my kids too. I was in Arizona, there in Illinois. First time I'd ever really been away from them. So that's when I was having the suicidal thoughts, and thankfully, because of my children, I was strong enough in that moment of weakness to say, I'm not doing this to my kids. I need to get help. So I went, and there was a stigma attached to going to mental health, which is what the section of the hospital on basis was called, mental health. They ended up changing it to something else because that name alone carried its own stigma. They said, only the crazy people go there. And if you're in there, whatever. And here I am, I'm a senior master sergeant, overseeing 30 people. And I'm sitting in the waiting room of this mental health clinic seeking help. Right. But I did. And, that's when I started to really realize that I was dealing with some things that were unresolved in my life, and still may be in some aspects. I've learned to deal with it and cope a lot better now than I did before. But that's when it really started to come out. So you're talking, I retired in 16. I was there from 2012, 13 to 6. So I was 38 years old, 74. Yeah, or 38, almost pushing 40, having lived with this my whole life. And then about 40 years old, now all of a sudden it's all coming out. So I had a counselor that I talked to every week, and lots of tears, lots of anger, lots of all sorts of things, and talked to her, as honestly as I could about being involved with a married woman at the time, because I was, and you in the military, you can't really do that. So I never really talked about it. So having that outlet was good for me, to have that person that I could discuss that with. And then going back to the childhood, it all just kind of reared its ugly head, and then ugly kind of became a good thing, because I started to realize, okay, here are the reasons why X, Y, and Z may be happening. Here are the reasons why that happened to me then, or wow, now that makes sense, or that makes sense. And it was just really an epiphany, a lot of light bulbs going off on so many different levels as to how I was and the reason why I was. And then I was on my journey with God, and I got baptized. It ended up being the funniest thing, because one of my subordinates, when I first got to Arizona, I walked into his office as I was meeting people, and I heard rap music. His name's Tim Boyer. He's still a very, very good friend of mine today. There was rap music playing, but there was a divinity degree on the wall. And I thought, that's so odd. This guy is listening to rap music, but he's a pastor, but he's also a tech sergeant, a photojournalist that works for me. Like this, the whole thing is just weird to me.
Yeah.
And Tim, he'll listen to this and he'll find it funny because that's a story I always tell and we always laugh about it. The rapper ended up being I have to say that the rapper ended up being Lecrae, who for most of us music lovers know that Lecrae was a Christian rapper. So there wasn't a whole bunch of F-bombs and other things flying around the office. It wasn't like that. But I didn't know that at the time. I heard the rap music and wasn't really focusing on what was being said. And ultimately, Tim ended up going into the reserves, got commissioned as an officer chaplain, and now serves as a reserve chaplain in the Air Force. So I am super proud of him for that. But he became my best friend. Not necessarily the thing you're supposed to do is be best friends with your subordinates. Everybody knew he was my favorite, so it really didn't matter. But he just became my closest friend and confidant and counselor, if you will, too, because he was a pastor and he did know what I was going through and he knew everything. And he was always telling me, Dave, this woman is not what God has delivered for you. And he knew I was in love and I was struggling and I would fly back and forth. And so I battled with that, but he baptized me and I was headed down that road. And so I retired and I moved back to Illinois where my kids were, because even though they were getting older, I needed to be present for them. I knew I wasn't going to have them every other weekend. And I told them, like, you realize you guys got friends and your phones and your boyfriends and your cars, and that's cool, but I'm going to be here. If you want to call and get Starbucks in the morning, which my youngest did. If you want to come home from college and say, Dad, I'm home, you want to go to lunch, I'm going to be here. And those are the things that we ultimately would end up doing. My oldest daughter went to Illinois. My middle daughter went to Mizzou. And then my youngest went to one of the colleges that was right there in town. So they were all within a few hours of home, which is where their mom was. So I didn't want to leave Arizona. I loved it, but I had to be present. I had to be there. I wasn't going to see them all the time, but I had to be close. And it was, I think that alone showed them that I would sacrifice for them. And I think it's built the relationships that I have, the great relationships I have with them now. I say all that to say I rented this 4,000 square foot house on a lake. No earthly reason for having a house this big whatsoever. They weren't ever really there that long to have a house that big, but it was on a lake. I loved it. There was a paddle boat in the back, and I bought a bunch of fishing stuff, and I would go out there at 6 a.m. and just paddle around the lake and fish and just enjoy retirement for a little while. There was a program on TV one night, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was like a Jesus Christ Superstar thing on ABC or NBC, where all the big name actors, and they'd close down streets in a city and they carrying a cross, and they were singing different religious songs, and it was actors and musicians and all the celebrity types. I don't remember what it was, but I was watching it and I just felt this overwhelming calling that was like, Dave, you need to tell your story. And so I'd gone from the little kid, struggling, to retiring and kind of having a handle on things. So I had all of that start, that finish, and everything in between. And so I was just and I was doing well then, still dealing with that toxic relationship even after I retired, but I was doing okay and starting to really come to the realization that my life was elsewhere. But that overwhelming feeling was something I couldn't shake it. And so, like I said, feeling like, God has called me to do something. I'm not going to disappoint him. So I had a little Post-it pad and I started jotting down little things. And I was like, okay. So the next morning I went to Walmart and I bought a new laptop, and there was a sunroom that oversaw the lake in that house. And I sat there and wrote my book. And it took me, I think it was 8 days to do the first version, because I literally was just dumping everything that from start to finish. It was kind of doing chronological order, and then it jumped to other things. And it was just an outpouring of 40 plus years of stuff. And I feel like that was kind of what God had intended. I needed to just let a lot of stuff go. Mm-hmm. I think I have like 12 or 13 different manuscripts before the final book. And a lot of the early ones were just pointing fingers and placing blame and dumping a lot of stuff out there. But ultimately realizing that was never God's intent for me to place blame and talk bad about all these people and the things that they had done to me and poor me. It was more about, here's what happened to me. Here's how I acted and the things that I did. And now here I am being accountable for that. Mm-hmm. And this is what I did and how God kind of shifted things. That was the moment when I knew I had to do it, and I just didn't question it. I just sat down and wrote. And I love to write anyway. It's what I've done my whole life. It's what I do for my job now, pretty much. Mm-hmm. And so that part of it comes easy for me to be able to kind of take what's going on in my head all jumbled up and put it into some coherent thing to read. But I just, that overwhelming feeling that I had that God was saying, people can benefit from this. There are things that people need to know, whether it's about your faith, whether it's about PTSD in general, whether it's about how you can start out being a lying, cheating person that no one likes and end up being a loving, caring person in a great marriage with a great woman who you now know you deserve, and those things, how you can just, you don't have to stay stuck. And I feel like God needed me to, or wanted me to put all that out there so someone else could benefit from that. And I always said, you know, if one person read it and it was like, holy cow, that's me. I can, that's a thing. I can talk about that and I can get better. Yeah. And that was worth it. And there was, I didn't write a book to get rich, but there's no amount of money you can put on, 20, 30, 40 people messaging you saying, holy cow, didn't know that about you. And, oh, by the way, I'm dealing with some of this now too. And this helps. Right. Yeah.
Well, the book's really well done. And, I read it almost immediately after I kind of contacted you. And, it's one of those things that I think is important because it's a book of transformation, and I think oftentimes that is most people's journey. And it's a matter, I believe, that God wants to redeem everything back to him. And, we live in a fallen, broken world, and God's plan is to resurrect all of this back to him. And, that was the joy of reading your story. And as you and I had a phone conversation, I think last week, I think you're getting close to being ready to write a second one for the things that you were sharing me that have taken place after The Shelf, which I think you released in 2019. Here we are, several years later, and it sounds like there's even more that you could share in that story of redemption. And maybe there's a part 2 in your future. I'm not putting that on you that it's necessary, but when you and I talked after I'd finished the book and you shared where you're at now and some things that God's been doing in your life, it's like, well, that pretty much lends it to, continuing the conversation of The Shelf. Dave, if you wouldn't mind maybe sharing a little bit about where life is at just today, what you're into, what's going on, and then where can people find you and find the book?
Sure. So the first book ends with me as the director of communications at a Methodist church in Southern Illinois. My brother, the one who I hadn't, and people can read this if they get the book, but the journey with my brother is a pretty amazing one too. I mentioned that we were separated when we were younger. And then I came in the military, he followed, and then we spent half of our careers together, stationed together in South Carolina and Okinawa, Japan. So we spent more of our time together in the military than we did growing up, which is awesome. It's not like I didn't know him. It wasn't one of those, you reunited with your brother after 20 years. It wasn't like that. I saw him enough to where we knew we were best friends. We knew each other. We had a good relationship. I missed him growing up. I wish that he had been with me more, but we more than made up for that in the military. We played on the same intramural football teams, softball teams. We played against each other in basketball. I mean, it was just such an amazing thing for us to be able to be together. And so he married a active duty military woman, and she ended up getting stationed at Scott Air Force Base, which was Southern Illinois, which is where I was. So once again, we're back together, and they're actually the ones that found Troy United Methodist Church where I got the job. I was struggling at the time, and my brother and I would watch football on Sundays together, and I was at his house waiting for them to come back from church, and I was struggling kind of with things at the time, so I wasn't going to church. And he kept trying to get me to go, and I would resist. And then he came home one day and said, "Hey, I think they announced that there's a job at the church. I think it would be perfect for you." Long story short, I applied for it and I got it. So my brother's there, and now I'm going to church, and it was just a great thing. So that's where the book ends, is with me being there. But what happened was there was a church leaders conference in Tennessee, and I was the non-pastoral crew. You had secretaries, and you had the communications person, and then you had the pastors. Well, the majority of the pastors were going to the church leaders conference, and the senior pastor wanted me to go. And I didn't really think it was a thing for me as a communications guy, but he really wanted me to go. And he was a great guy, and sort of a mentor for me, and I didn't want to disappoint him. So I went, and the office manager lady, she knew that I didn't want to go, and we were talking about it. Like, I'm going to go. Andy wants me to go. And she said, "You just never know. You might find your soulmate there," as a joke.
Right.
Little did she know.
Yeah.
And so my toxic relationship had ended at this point. I knew enough to know that it was time. Mm-hmm. And so I moved on, and was able to get over that, which was wonderful. So my buddy had dabbled in dating apps at the time. I really wasn't into all that, but I ended up on some and didn't really like it. So I got rid of them. And then there was this one called Bumble, where kind of the women take the lead. You can't really talk to them unless they accept you, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so that was really the only one that I had. And I went to this church leaders conference, and I'm sitting there one day and just happened to pop open the app, and this woman appeared, and she was a writer, and she had competed in bodybuilding, which is, I was a professional bodybuilder for a few years. And she had lost her mother a while back, and had written a blog about that, and was just really, as a writer myself, really kind of in tune with, her brilliance, because she's just a brilliant woman. And so I was like, wow, and she's beautiful on top of it. So long story short, we ended up matching. But what I didn't realize is that the app GPS was around where you are versus where you're from. So this woman was in Clarksville, Tennessee, not Southern Illinois. So, at that point, I'm like, oh, of course, it was too good to be true. No wonder. Right. So I mentioned that to her, and she said, well, I think that was a Wednesday. And then I was like, I was thinking about getting a hotel and checking out Nashville this weekend, because I had never been to Nashville. And she's like, well, maybe Friday night we can get together, if not anything, we have another friend, and so that's exactly what we did. We met Friday night and had some drinks, and then Saturday we met, and she took me downtown and showed me around, and then I left, and she came to visit me in I say St. Louis because it's practically St. Louis, that far south, Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
And I would come to Clarksville, and a few months later, we kind of realized, we joke about it even now, that it was just easy. There was never really we didn't go through the normal apprehension and anxiety of relationships. We just kind of did our thing. And, next thing you know, we're sitting on a couch a few months later and talking about, so, what size ring would you want, or rock would you want if I asked you to marry me? And she pulled up and showed me what she wanted. And it just seemed so natural. And in a situation like that, where I normally would have been so scared off or afraid of, the rejection and all the things that I had felt prior to, it was just so simple and easy. In March, that following year, I started my job here at the VA. So she found a job for me, actually. Said, hey, you said you want to work in the VA. Here's a job right here in Nashville. I applied, 37 applicants. I got the job.
Wow.
So I was like, well, okay, now I need to start looking for places in Nashville. And I'm at that point where my kids are all grown, and I'm still within a few hours. And my oldest daughter married an Army guy, and they're gone. So it's like, I feel okay with, I was present for long enough. Now it's time for dad to kind of go live. And they understood that. They weren't little kids anymore. And again, another one of those things, no apprehension, no anxiety. It was just easy. The relationship started for the right reason. So going back to what I said before, first marriage, child, marriage, no trust, whatever. Next one, married woman, toxic, whatever. This one, dating app, dating, all the things normal people do. Okay, maybe this is what God had intended. And I truly believe that was the case, because everything in our life has just been so simple. And just talked about it here the other day. Like, we just fall in love with each other more every single day. And so I got that job at the VA in March and moved. And then we decided, or I decided that ring that I had talked to her about a few months earlier, that she showed me, that it was time. And so that's what she wears now, is that ring that she showed me that day, months prior, or months, a couple months into our relationship. That's the one she's wearing now. And asked her to marry me. We bought a house. So we live in Mount Juliet, Tennessee, in a big, beautiful house. And stepdaughter has a whole second floor to herself, and she loves school. And I mean, we've owned a few boats, and we were lake people for a while, and not a few boats at the same time. We've gone through them. We've sunk one, actually. But I say all that to say it's just a good life, and it's all the things that you would ever want. And I say that part about it being easy for a reason, because I feel like that's when it's right and it's God, and that's the way it is. And I've never experienced anything like this, and how it all came about, and how easy it was, and how easy it was to ask her to marry me, how easy it was to get a new job, and then buy a house, and then get married. And I had all the people from my buddies from my career there at our wedding, and family, and it was just,
it's great.
It's only something that God can do, and that's what we talk about. Like, our life is just God led and meant to be. It's a cool thing.
I think it's great to be in this position, because you can look back and see now what God's plan was. When we're in the middle of our storms, and when we're in the middle of our traumas, and we're in the middle of our adversity, sometimes it's so hard to see what God's doing. And you have an opportunity now to take a look at your life and take the inventory of all of these things that you just listed off and go, thank you, Lord, because you certainly wouldn't have chosen the direction that you got to get to this point in your life. But it just reminds me, God's got a plan. That's where our faith is so important. Our faith comes in.
This whole thing is exactly what you said, being able to look back.
Yeah.
And I've done that so many times, like literally have been by myself and kind of looked up like, my bad.
Yeah. You got this.
You got always been better when I just trust you to take care of the things that I need and you realize it. Like, I mean, you see it in the book that there are so many things where unless I hadn't lived it all myself to know that it's true, I wouldn't believe it. There are those types of things in that book that show like God canceled deployments in order to get me to this place, in order to get me to meet this person, to get baptized, to find God, to get a job in a church that led me to my wife. You know, it's like
totally
that's the whole thing. And it's amazing.
So where can people get the book, and where can people find you if they want to follow you on any of the social media sites?
So Facebook is just my name, Dave DeRemer. Instagram, which I don't really use a whole lot, but it's the shelf _ Dave DeRemer. I do look at it every once in a while. The book can be found. It's on Amazon, Books A Million. It's actually in some Barnes and Noble stores, which you can get on Barnes and Noble website too. Generally, if I'm looking for it on Amazon, I just type in the shelf Dave DeRemer and it'll pop right up. But,
and I'll put a link in to the show notes if anybody's wanting to check Dave's book out. Dave, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for your transparency and your openness on our XM podcast. I really, really appreciate just spending time with you and hearing your story, and from such a vulnerable place. That I think that's so important. You know, I think that's what helps people get over a lot of that isolation, is feeling like, oh man, I just listened to a podcast. This guy, Dave, he went through some similar things, and wow, he was able to do this. Maybe if it's like that. I always call it the island effect. The more and more you feel like you're all alone on an island, the harder and harder it is to navigate life. And I say this a lot too. God uses his people to help his people. And I think you've done that today. And really, really appreciate you. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate the opportunity. Like you said, there's just a lot of good out there if people are willing to listen to it and realize that they're not alone. That was the whole purpose of writing the book in the first place, was to help people realize that. So thanks for letting me share that with people.
Thank you, Dave, for being so open about your life and sharing all that you have endured, accomplished, overcome, and how God has used that for his goodness. The link to his book, The Shelf, Faith, PTSD, and Overcoming Me, will be in the show notes. We covered a lot in this interview, but there is so much more to his story that's in his book. No question, we all will face adversity in our life. The truth and reality of that are riddled throughout Scripture. The hope is it drives you back to the Redeemer. Not everyone finds the healing they need. Dave certainly did, and the joy he is experiencing is evidence of that. Finding Jesus doesn't make life easier, but it changes everything in how we experience life. Well, thank you for listening. Until next time, or when our Savior comes, God bless.